Good day, welcome to today's class. If this is your first time on this channel, please click the red subscription button to subscribe to this YouTube channel so that when we drop more videos, you get notified. So in this class, we'll be talking about a very interesting topic, and that's overheads. Yes, overheads. So now, the question is, what do you mean by overheads? Overheads are costs or expenses that cannot be traced to a particular cost center. Yes, they are indirect costs. Yes, we call them indirect costs. I will explain. Just follow the video. We call them indirect cost also. So it's now you call them overhead or you call them indirect cost. Now the question is, let me explain overhead, giving you guys a good illustration. Now look at the cost of raw materials. The cost of raw materials. Let's say the cost of raw materials is 7,000 naira. The question is, why am I buying raw materials? The reason I'm buying raw materials is because I can use them in production. Now I can easily charge raw materials to a particular production center, which is production department. So the reason I am buying raw materials is for production. I cannot say these raw materials I want to use them to clean the office, or I want to use these raw materials to light the organization. Is not possible. So raw materials can be traced to a particular cost unit, to a particular cost center. So raw materials is a direct cost. It's not an overhead. Cost of raw materials. But look at a situation where we have lighting. Now if you look at lighting now in an organization, if you have been to a big organization before, in an organization, lighting is not for only the production department. Lighting is for, you can use lights will be in the production department, in the finance department, probably in the office that we have in the organization, in the human resources department. So lighting is a good example of overheads. Why? Because it serves different purpose. It serves various purposes. So it serves various purposes. So in that situation, lighting cannot be traced to a particular cost center. So that's what we mean by what? Overheads or indirect costs. Costs that cannot be traced to a particular unit cost center. We call them overhead costs. Now let's what I'll be dwelling majorly on for this video is overhead absorption. Yeah, overhead absorption. Now, what do you mean by overhead absorption? If I have costs that cannot be traced to a particular cost center, how am I going to apportion them? Am I going to charge those costs on a particular unit of production, or how am I going to do it? Let's cite a good example so that we will get it. Let's say the direct materials of producing a particular product, direct materials, is the cost is $10. Everything is in dollars. The direct labor is $12. The fixed overhead, let's say rent is let's say $1,000. Now how am I going to apportion this rent? Because if you look at it, there's nothing like rent per product. This is the direct materials per product per unit, $10. Direct labor per unit, $10, $12. But rent, I'm going to pay aggregate for rent. And rent, if you look at rent as itself, it serves different purposes. Rent, on that same rent or on that same place I rented, I will have my production department, my servicing department, and other departments. So rent is an example of overheads or indirect cost. Now let's say I produce, the quantity of goods I produce is just 100. So for me to produce 1 unit out of the 100, I spent direct materials, which is $10, direct labor, which is $12. So but how much of rent did I spend on 1 product? So that is how I'm going to determine how much I'm going to set as my price and how much I'm going to set as my price. Yes, so I can make profit. Because if I say, if my direct materials is $10, My direct materials, sorry, is $10 plus my direct labor is $12, which is making $22, right? So definitely I can say my total direct cost on a product is $22. So for me to make profit, I will say let me charge maybe $23, $24, $25 and above. But if I'm producing 100 quantity, do you agree with me that the cost at which I'm producing or the price I'm charging for this product does not cover this overhead, does not include the overhead? Yes, that this $10, which is the direct materials, plus $12, which is the direct labor, is equal to 22. If I'm charging $22 for my product, it does not cover my rent, which is $1,000. So am I going to charge this $1,000 on a single product, or how am I going to do it? Now the thing is that I need to get rent per unit. How am I going to do that? And we call that overhead absorption rate. Yes, overhead absorption rate. So, so how am I going to calculate my overhead absorption rate? I will take my overhead, which is 1,000, overhead, which is 1,000 divided by how many quantity did I produce? I produced 100 quantities. So I'm going to get the amount of rent I'm going to charge on each product. So if I'm producing 100 quantity, so 1,000 divided by 100, this cancel this, I'm left with 10. So the overhead absorption rate is $10 on each unit. So what does this mean, or how am I going to interpret this? I'm going to say I'm going to charge rent for one unit now, $10 for my 100 quantity, for me to be able to cover this amount of this rent. So I'm going to say, instead of doing it this way, I'm going to say my direct materials, which is $10, my direct labor, which is $12, plus my rent, which is my overhead absorption rate. That means that is why I said overhead absorption rate is the rate at which each product absorb the overheads. Each product absorb the overhead. So each product is absorbing $10 of the rent. So $12 of direct labor, of direct materials, 12 of direct labor, and rent, which is 10. Then I'm going to be having $32 as my cost of production. So if $32 is my cost, then I can now charge, let's say, $35 for me to be able to make profit. So in this situation, what have I done? I've calculated the amount each product I produce is going to absorb of the overhead costs. So that's what I mean by what? Overhead absorption rate or overhead absorption. So on the illustration we solved earlier, we said our rent, which is our overhead, is $1,000 and the quantity produced is 100. So now for me to get the amount of overhead that each product produced will absorb, I divide my rent by my quantity produced, so that I will going to have $1,000 divided by 100, and that gives me $10 per product produced. So in that situation now, that means that per unit of product I produce, overhead absorbed is $10. So there are different methods or different formulas we use. We can use unit per unit of product produced. Yes, total units produced. We can use the direct labor hour. We can use the direct material cost and a lot. So we are going to look at some formulas we use in calculating overhead absorption rate. So examine the formula. We start with direct labor hours. So direct labor hour, the formula to calculate overhead absorption rate using the direct labor hour is equals to total overhead divided by the total labor hour. So what does this mean? This simply means that, for this now we get the overhead per unit of goods produced. So on this one you get overhead per labor hour worked. So if total overhead divided by total labor hour, so that means that overhead per one labor hour, that's what you're going to get. This, if you divide by the quantity, you get overhead per unit of product produced. So we have direct labor hour, we have machine hour rate, machine hour rate, which is total overhead. Everything starts with total overhead. So total overhead divided by total machine hour. Total machine hour. So what are you going to get here? You're going to get overhead consumed or overhead absorbed per machine hour. That is what you are going to get here. So this that we did is overhead absorbed per unit of product produced. This will give you overhead absorbed per direct labor hour, and this will give you overhead produced per machine hour rate. So, and the next one we are going to examine is production unit, and which is what we examine here. Production unit or production unit or overhead absorbed per unit of production, and that's total overhead divided by total units produced. So these are the three major methods or three major ways by which we calculate our overhead absorption rate. Of course, there are many more, but the ones you will always see in your exams are majorly on these three. So according to what I have here now, we have direct labor cost percentage, and that's just total overhead over direct labor cost times 100. Direct prime cost percentage, total overhead over direct over prime cost times 100. So all these are just the formula. So let's look at those ones too, so that let's just touch everything randomly. So we have direct labor cost percentage. So we have for direct labor cost percentage, so will be total overhead. Don't forget that everything starts with total overhead. Total overhead divided by direct labor cost times 100, because it is in percentage. So another one, we have direct material cost percentage. So direct materials cost percentage, it will still be total overhead over direct material cost, total direct material cost times 100. So, and lastly, we have prime cost percentage. Prime cost percentage, which is total overhead over prime cost times 100. So the three major ones you will always see are the ones we've examined before. This one too, you also come across them, but it's on a very rare occasions. So let's take a question. Let's calculate the overhead absorption rate using all these formula. Let's look at them. Overhead absorption rate using the total units produced, overhead per unit. So overhead absorption rate per labor hours, that means divided by labor hours. Overhead absorption rate per machine hour. Overhead absorption rate per direct labor cost percentage, per what direct material cost percentage, and prime cost percentage. Let's look at a question and let's solve together. So let's go. We have a question already. From the question, we have our direct labor cost should be 800,000, direct material cost to be 900,000. We have our fixed overhead to be 600,000. We have our direct labor hours to be 50,000. Our total machine hour to be 15,000, and total output to be 100,000. So using the sixth method, calculate the overhead absorption rate. So let's start with the three most common ones, then we end it with the three least common ones. So let's start with overhead absorption rate per unit of goods produced. That's, you should know that that is overhead or total overhead divided by total units produced. That will give you overhead per unit of goods produced. So we have overhead absorption rates, so per unit produced, overhead absorption rates per unit produced. That will be, it's necessary for you to state the formula. So that will be total overhead over total units produced, total units. So from the question, we are given that our fixed overhead is 600,000. So 600,000 divided by how many units were produced, total output. We're told that it is 100,000. So if you divide 600,000 divided by 100, you get $6. Let's put it in dollars. So $6 is what we are going to charge extra on each unit produced as our amount or our cost for overhead. So let's go. Let's use the overhead per direct labor hour. So overhead absorption rate per direct labor hour. Permit me to shorten it that way. So that will be total overhead divided by total direct labor hour. So total overhead is already 600,000. Don't forget that I said everything starts with 600,000 divided by total labor hour. From the question, direct labor hours is 50,000. So 50,000. So if you take 600,000 divided by 50,000, you have 12. So that means $12. So that means that per direct labor hour, the overhead absorbed is $12. So that means for 1 hour of production, there's extra $12 absorbed on each product for overheads. So let's go for machine hour rates, overhead absorption rates for using what the machine hour. So total overhead divided by total machine hour. So total overhead is 600,000 divided by total machine hour from our question is 15,000. So if you divide that 600,000 divided by 15,000, that will give us $40 per machine hour. $40. So for 1 machine hour of production, overhead absorbed is $40. So let's go to the three least common ones and let's solve using them also. So we calculate our overhead absorbed per direct labor cost percentage, and as you know, I said you always start with what overhead. So direct labor cost percentage, and that will be total overhead divided by direct labor cost times 100. So total overhead is 600,000. Direct labor cost from our question is 800,000. 800,000 times 100. So that gives us what? 600,000 divided by 800 times 100. That's 75%. 75%. So let's go overhead absorbed per prime cost percentage. So prime cost percentage. So prime cost percentage, we have total overhead divided by total or prime cost times 100. So total overhead, as we already know, is 600,000 divided by prime cost. You should know that our prime cost is the addition of our total variable cost. And if you look at the question, we have two variable costs, and which is direct labor cost and direct material cost. Which is direct labor cost is 800,000, direct material cost is 900,000, and that gives us 1,700,000. So 1,700,000 times 100. So 600,000 divided by 1,700,000 times 100, that gives us 35.3%. 35.3%. And the last one, which is overhead absorbed using the direct material cost. So direct material cost percentage. So that will be total overhead divided by direct material costs times 100. So total overhead is 600,000 divided by direct material cost. From our question, our direct material cost is 900,000 times 100. So 600,000 divided by 900,000 times 100. That gives us 66.67%. 66.67%. So we've come to the end of today's class. I already told you guys earlier that the most important three is direct labor overhead absorption rate per unit produced, overhead absorption rate per direct labor hours, and overhead absorption rate per direct machine hours. So these are the most important three that you need to know. It's a must, but majorly on the unit produced. So this brings us to the end of overhead absorption, this first class. In our next video class, we'll be explaining the concept of under absorption and over absorption. For you to get notified, click the subscription button. We'll see you again in our next video class. Thank you.